If you've never laid hands on one of these before, then you're not exactly alone. This is an example of Sega's ill-fated add-on for the Genesis, the Sega CD. You could argue that it marked the beginning of the end for Sega, a turning point, rapidly followed by a string of failed add-ons and consoles, the 32X, the CDX, the Neptune, and eventually the Saturn. The Sega CD wasn't the first CD gaming system to hit the market. It was technically beaten to the marketplace by another add-on that was actually successful, the CD add-on for the PC Engine, otherwise known as the TurboGrafx 16. The Sega CD was the first viable entry into the American market, though, and it led us wide-eyed and naive into the world of blocky video, lousy FMV games, and cheesy voice acting.
Come and get me!
Part of the Sega CD's lack of ubiquity has to do with its lousy sales figures. Only 6 million of the things were ever sold in the entire world combined. 6 million sounds like a lot on paper, but keep in mind that this figure has to be compared to the excess of 29 million regular Genesis units that were sold before it. Finding working Sega CDs then is a bit like pulling hen's teeth. There are probably more of them resting in landfills than there are viable units existing anywhere else, and the units that are kicking around today are frequently very broken. My unit here is broken as well, though naturally we'll address that in a moment. Before that, let's indulge in the sheer lunacy of the thing. The Sega Genesis was, semi-fortunately, designed with expansion in mind. Lurking beneath the cover on the right-hand edge is the so-called piano connector, a finicky card edge connector that was ultimately used to connect the Genesis to the Sega CD. This threaded screw hole on the bottom of the machine is also not without purpose. There's a big metal locking plate that has to be installed here before the Genesis can be used with the CD unit. And then there's this bit of metal that goes in the vents, and this other bit of metal that's meant to go with the expansion connector, somehow. I normally keep my consoles in this big stack of milk crates here. It's an easy system. One crate, one console. All my cables, power supplies, accessories, controllers, everything you need, all in one easy to store and transport unit. But look at this. Even by itself, with no Sega Genesis attached to it, the Sega CD doesn't fit in a milk crate. It's huge. To make matters worse, this thing's actually designed to be used with the smaller Genesis 2, which fits here. I have a Genesis 2, but it's at Redman's right now, so I'm forced to use my trusty old Model 1. The Model 1 is so large, it hangs over the edge of the unit. There's actually supposed to be a spacer block that goes here in order to support the overhanging edge of the Model 1, but my Sega CD hasn't got one. And even if it did, it would only be even bigger. It doesn't help that the thing's broken. The Sega CD is supposed to automatically power on when you power on your Genesis, but no power light. And thus we have retired to my chronically messy workbench to diagnose a very common problem that you'll find with the Sega CD unit. I've already taken the screws out of this unit just for the sake of brevity, and you'll note that, dear Lord, are there a lot of them. I have them all stuck to this magnet here. Not only are there 6 that hold the casing on, but there's like 8 or something that hold this piece of shielding on, all hidden around on the corners and stuff that you'll have to take off. This shielding itself is also a ginormous pain in the ass. That's a technical term, by the way, because of these 2 little tabs here that you've got to pull out. Otherwise they catch on the bottom of the piano connector here, and you won't actually be able to lift the shielding up. So you kind of have to have a screwdriver in 4 hands to lift up all the corners and to pry these tabs out. What I will draw your attention to here is probably the most common failure point. This little green resistor looking component here, even though it looks like a discrete electronic component, is actually a fuse, and is commonly blown by power surges or the crappy power supplies that the CD unit originally came with, and thus units are often put away broken and then they get sold that way, and you find them with this problem. If you have a Sega CD unit that won't power on at all, you can get out your multimeter, and I have mine in continuity mode here, so when I touch anything conductive it'll beep. And you can just get across the legs of this fuse and you can check it for continuity. You can see here I've got no beep, so we should suspect our fuse is the problem with this console. So you say, that's great, I have a blown fuse. Where the hell am I going to find another one like that? Well, the truth is, I don't know. What I do know is you can find a suitable replacement like these. It is, of course, somewhat imperative to use the right fuse. The original fuse in the CD unit is a 21 volt 2 amp, which is kind of an odd designation. The voltage rating really isn't all that important, but what is important is the amperage rating. So as you can see here, even though these are the wrong form factor of fuse, or these mini ceramic type, They are 2 amp, so they should be suitable for our application. You might hear recommendations to put a higher rated fuse in your unit, but that's not really a good idea, because the fuse is there for a reason, and if you allow more current to pass through the fuse than the system is designed to tolerate, you could blow the whole thing entirely and you'd have a much bigger problem than a simple fuse. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to cheat. We're going to take our little tiny, impractically small fuse, and we're just going to tack some wire onto it so we can add it to the solder points on the CD unit. I'm just going to sand the ends of this fuse a little bit with some fine sandpaper just to make sure the solder sticks. Fuses really aren't designed to have anything soldered to them. It struck me that every time I've soldered anything on camera on this show, I've used it as an opportunity to give some kind of bullshit mini tutorial about how you should be doing this stuff. And you know what? Today I'm not doing that. If you don't know how to heat up a piece of solder with a soldering iron, you shouldn't be doing this. And if you really don't have any clue of how to perform these sorts of things, there are plenty of tutorials on the internet that can explain this sort of thing way better than I could in a 30-second video clip. The only advice I do have is not to keep the soldering iron on the fuse for too long, because if you heat it up too much, you could prematurely blow the fuse by melting the wire inside of it. First thing I'm going to do is test continuity on my fabricated fuse to make sure I didn't screw it up. The second thing I'm going to do is try and stave off a lot of questions by pointing out clearly where the fuse is on the original CD unit. Right here is the port block, where you plug everything in, the power cord and all that stuff. Just to the north and slightly to the west, this little green thing right here, that's where the fuse is. Check this out. You want to see how we know this fuse is blown? Doink. May as well just get this right out of the way. Here's the back of the board. Our fuse terminals are these two right here on the edge of this square. It's actually much easier to unsolder the fuse from the back than it is from the front, because you don't have to worry about poking your soldering iron down in there and melting the plastic. No! Yeesh. Well, there's our old fuse. Why do console makers insist on using high temperature solder that's impossible to melt? At least putting in the new fuse should be a lot easier because you can use your own solder. Just your typical four-handed job. Now what we've got to do is put this abomination back together and see if it works. And there is, of course, the smoke test. It's interesting to note that the Sega CD, just like later CD consoles, can be powered up without anything in it at all. So, we have a winner. With the fuse replaced in our Sega CD, it's given a new lease on life, and we can use it to play some classic games, like Sonic CD, and Sonic CD. Oh, and Sonic CD. Why do I torture myself this way? Anyway, the problem with the Sega CD is this. It uses exactly the same power supply as the original Genesis. How's that a problem? Well, it's easy. You can tell by the heft of this thing that it's a linear power supply. No voltage regulation. It's just a transformer and a rectifier. If any power surge comes down the wire, this thing will convert it into a high voltage current and send it right into the console it's powering. This isn't a problem with things like the original Genesis because it has a hard power switch. Click it off, it's off. Contact is broken. No voltage gets through to the unit. Not so with the Sega CD. It has a soft power switch because it has to power on when the Genesis does. Because of this, there's always some current running through the console. Some part of its circuitry is always live. And whenever a power surge comes down through the crappy power supply, it can blow the unit. Sega knew this when they designed the Sega CD, but they had to build the consoles down to a price. Instead of opting for a more robust but more expensive system like voltage regulation or just a better goddamn power supply, they decided to put a little fuse in it. The little fuse gets blown because people never unplug their consoles and power surges have to happen sometime, and any console with a blown fuse usually just gets assumed as trash and thrown in the garbage. Every time that happens, the Sega CD becomes just a little tiny bit rarer.
And who's saying that's a bad thing?